Today, I'm going to show you how I make adjustments to the bodices of sewing patterns to take into account my well-blessed figure. So if you have melons instead of peaches, you'll want to stick around. In my last video, I showed you how I drafted an early 1940s foundation using the Haslam pattern cutting system. And my understanding is that the foundation is similar to a sloper, although it's technically not a sloper. And that then I'll use it to draft patterns using the Haslam system. We'll put that to the test in a future video. Anyway, I'll put the link to that video in the description box below if you want to take a look at it. And that video also describes the history of the Haslam pattern cutting system. After I made a draft of the foundation, I made a mock-up. Now, I'm going to be real. Unless you have a fashion model figure, there's going to need to be some tweaks made to your sloper or your foundation. I certainly don't have a fashion model figure, never had. And I take comfort in knowing that even the big couture houses require tweaks to be made on the patterns and the garments that have been made to the measurements of their clients. So instead of being annoyed that you have to make a mock-up and make changes and so forth, just pretend that you are a sewist or a seamstress in a high-end couture atelier, and you are making a garment for the best and your favorite client. That would be you. Okay, so let's take a look at what the mock-up told me about the changes that I need to make. And I drafted the pattern using Miss Haslam's full figure instructions. So I want to be clear about that. Oh, and since some sewing YouTubers sometimes get their videos labeled as inappropriate or risque when talking about this topic, we'll be using fruit as a substitute when discussing size issues. Now, if the technical discussion of how to make sewing adjustments for larger fruit is problematic for you, I encourage you to click away right now. Okay, now that we've got that cleared up. Aside from the flashback to wearing mini skirts in the 70s and how grateful I was when gunny sacks and prairie dresses came into fashion, the first and biggest, no pun intended, thing that jumps out is my bustline. If you're like me and have melons instead of peaches, you may have the same issues I'll talk about that give our sewing projects that loving hands made from home frumpy look. And that's not what we're going for, right? With a couple of adjustments, we can look just as elegant as our peach-sized friend. So the first issue, my bustline and the bodice's bustline don't match. The fullest part of the bodice is in the wrong place, way up too high, which means that the bodice is too tight across my fullest point. The second issue is the bodice is too short. And issue number 3, there's a little bit of bunching in my lower back, upper hip area that is easily remedied. A lot of sewists will immediately think that they've got a sway back issue to resolve, when it may be, as it was in my situation, a case of the hip circumference in the rear, because of my rear, being too tight and the skirt heading for a path of least resistance. Once I made the adjustments for the melons and added an inch to the width of the back skirt, the bunching resolved itself. So, true confession, I knew from previous experience that I was going to have to make what is called a full bust adjustment, also known as an FBA, because of how well blessed I am. And I've had to do it on previous patterns. I am pretty sure that there were wet nurses. I had wet a wet nurse or wet nurses as ancestors, because I blew right past peach and went straight for melon when I was in high school and still only weighed 115 pounds. So if I knew, why did I go ahead and draft the pattern as the instructions say? Well, first of all, as an educational psychologist, I just couldn't pass up this teachable moment. And then the second reason is doing the draft as it was created, making the draft as instructed helped me get a sense of what was going on with the pattern and how I would make the FBA. So I wanted to get a sense of what was going on with the pattern. So let's delve into the fruit basket a little bit, because if your full bust measurement is at least 2 to 3 inches larger than your upper bust, doing the strategies I'm going to show you today will transform how well your bodices fit and may solve fit issues without having to futz with shoulders and neckline and arm side, also known as your armhole. You'll hear it called both things, in order to get a good fit. You may not need to deal with all those other issues after you make a full bust adjustment. Have you ever bought a dress or a blouse based on your bust measurement only to have it huge on you? The armholes on a sleeveless dress are so big that your undergarments show, the neckline is huge and gaps, and if it has sleeves, the shoulder seam line is halfway down your arm. Or how about buying a dress from a catalog and the waist seam on the model is at the waist? But when you try it on, it's like an empire waist with a seam right under your bosom. Or you buy a knit top and you're always tugging on it because it feels too short. And of course, if you have a button up the front top, you have to use safety pins to prevent gaposis and showing the world what undergarments you're wearing that day. The reason for this is because garments and patterns are usually made for women with a B or a C cup, an apple or a peach. Some pattern companies have expanded cup sizes up to a D, a navel orange. We'll call it a navel orange. But that isn't really helpful for those of us with cup sizes deeper into the alphabet. Those of us with melons who scared the sales staff, those poor young women at Victoria's Secret, when we go in and we just want to look at the pretty little lacy bras that are more for show, and they're so delicate and pretty, and they're not the feats of engineering required to hoist up a heavy bosom. But I digress. And we have to take into account the distance it takes to get from point A to point B. The mister and I will be taking a road trip in a few weeks to visit family, and we need to take into account the terrain. If the road were flat between our town and my hometown, we may put 300 miles on the car. If we had to go over, say, a hill, maybe we put 305 miles on the car. But since we have to go over a big mountain, we will put an extra 40 miles more on the car than if the road were flat. Our house and my sister's house haven't moved, but the terrain makes a big difference. And gravity impacts the location of our bustline too, but I couldn't figure out a good way to incorporate that into the road trip analogy, so we just have to run with it. Okay, so enough of background information. Theory, let's get to the nuts and bolts, brass tacks. Let's just get to the adjustments you may need to make. You will need to take 4 measurements wearing the undergarments you plan to wear, because you want your measurements to be accurate. And as an aside, I think that's probably why the big couture houses, in the vintage garments from the big couture houses, have all of that corsetry infrastructure in them, because then it ensures that the garment will always fit correctly. So you're going to measure from where your shoulder meets the neck to your bust apex, and that's the pointy part of the fruit. And then you're going to measure from your apex to apex. The shoulder to the apex and the apex to apex measurements help us make sure the darts are properly placed and pointing in the correct direction. Even if you don't need to make a full bust adjustment, doing this step make sure that the fullness of the bodice is in alignment with the fullness of your figure. And this adjustment is especially important as we reach a certain age, because pregnancies and gravity have a way of moving things further south. And the heavier we are, heavier the melons are, the more gravity does its job. If everything on your bodice fits, except for the darts going in the wrong direction, this is the part of the video you'll really want to pay attention to. Okay, you'll also need to take your upper bust, and this handy dandy measuring tape recommended by a viewer is a great tool if you don't have anyone else who can do the measuring for you. I'll put the link for it in the description box. And finally, you want to use your full bust. If the difference between your high bust and your full bust measurement is more than, say, 2 to 3 inches, then you'll want to do a full bust adjustment. Some sources say make the adjustment if it's more than 2 inches. And other sources say, no, only do it if it's more than 3 inches. I say it's so easy and it just takes a few minutes. Give it a try. See which way you like better. One thing to keep in mind is don't go by your bra cup size. You'll see some sources saying if you're wearing something larger than a D cup or something like that, you'll need to make a full bust adjustment. Don't go by bra cup size, because that sizing is a great mystery. It depends on the manufacturer, it depends on the country of origin, it depends on whether it's a full moon. I mean, it's crazy. So just go by your measurements. If your measurements between your high bust and your full bust are 2 to 3, if more than 2 to 3 inches different, then you'll want to do the full bust adjustment. So before we get started, we have to do some quick math, and I'll resist the urge to get on my soapbox about how short-sighted it was that schools decided that home ec courses weren't teaching anything useful, like, math or chemistry or child development. But like I said, I will resist for now. First, take the apex to apex measurement and divide it by 2. We divide it by 2 because we're only working with half of the pattern. This number tells us how far we need to measure in from the center front. The other math is, the other number we need to come up with is subtract your high bust measurement from your full bust measurement, and then divide that by 2. That is the amount for the adjustment you need to make for the full bust adjustment. So let's start with the dart placement first. Measuring in from the center front, make a vertical line equal to the distance from the center front, approximately where your apex will be. Make this vertical line several inches long. In the next step, the neck to apex line will connect with this line. If you're using the foundation, the Haslam foundation, from dot A, or from where the neckline meets the shoulder, measure down from the same point as you did to get your neckline to apex measurement, to intersect with the apex to apex line. This is where your darts will be pointing to for the best fit. Draw a circle and put a plus sign inside the circle to indicate that this is your bust apex point. Find the exact middle between your 2 dart legs along the shoulder line. Draw a straight line from the middle to the bust apex. And then you draw your dart. So note, here's something important. Your dart point should never, ever, ever end at your bust apex, or you'll end up with some weird pointiness. And so where the dart ends depends upon your bust measurement. So if your bust measurement is less than, your full bust measurement is less than 40 inches, you'll measure 5/8 to 1.5 inches up from the apex, depending upon your cup size. I know I just said don't use a cup size, but it gives you kind of an idea, right? So draw up the line you just drew and make a mark. This is where your dart point will end, and draw straight lines from this point to the ends of the dart legs. For bust measurements 40 inches and over, you're going to measure 2 to 3 inches up from the apex, depending on your cup size, up from the line you drew, and make a mark. This is where your dart point will end, and draw lines from this point to the ends of the dart legs. Now, here's a tip I read. I have not tried it yet, but I've heard, or I read, that drawing a slightly curved line, such as using the blue edge of the chart, will help make the darts on a larger bust line smoother. So like I said, I haven't tried it yet, but I plan on giving it a shot. And that's all there is to it. You can use that same process for the side seam, but just remember, when you're doing the side seam, you want it to be either angled straight or up. You never want your dart angled down, because then that looks a little frumpier. So either angled up a little bit or angled straight. A full bust adjustment is also easy, but requires some cutting and taping. You can pretend you're back in first grade. You will need a traced copy of your front bodice with the dart and bust apex drawn in, or at least where the dart legs end along the shoulder. Paper to tape your adjusted front bodice to, and any paper will work. I find it easier to use paper that is about 4 inches bigger all around than my trace bodice than trying to tape strips of paper into cutouts created by the adjustment. You want paper scissors, not your fabric scissors, a ruler, tape, and French curve or the red part of the Haslam chart. We'll be drawing 3 lines that connect through the bust apex. Then we'll cut the lines, not all the way through. We want hinges, and then spreading the lines apart. After that, we'll tape everything down, redraw the darts, and true some of the lines. And that's basically it. It will look complicated. It isn't complicated, okay? Draw a straight line from the center of the shoulder dart, midway between the 2 dart legs along the shoulder, to the bust apex. Draw a straight line from the center front through the bust apex to the side seam. The line should be perpendicular to the center front. Draw a line from the bust apex to the armscye or armhole, somewhere in the lower third of the curve. It doesn't have to be exact. And then draw a straight line on the backing paper to create a center front line for you to align the cut up parts to. Cut the line from the shoulder to the bust apex, but don't go through the apex. This will be one of your hinges. Now, if you accidentally cut through one of the hinges, it's okay. You can just put a little tape on there to make the hinge again. Cut the horizontal line from the center front through the bust apex, being careful not to accidentally cut through the hinge, and up to the armscye. Do not cut all the way through, because this will be your second hinge. Cut the horizontal line from the side seam to the bust apex. Do not cut all the way through, so that you have a hinge. But keep in mind, depending upon the size of your adjustment, you may need to snip that hinge to keep it from puckering as you spread the slashes. Using your ruler, place the 0 mark at the bust apex. Carefully move the part of the pattern below the horizontal line down until you reach your adjustment amount. So if your adjustment amount is 2.5 inches, like mine, you'll move the pattern piece down. You'll move the pattern piece down 2.5 inches. As you move the pattern piece down, you'll notice that the hinges cause it to also move away from the center front. This is what it's supposed to do. When you're done, the distance between the center front and the trace bodice will be approximately half of what your adjustment amount is, or at least that's what I found when doing it for me. By now, your shoulder dart will seem pretty huge. So we're going to do what's called rotate the side dart and the shoulder dart so that the widths are about equal. Start moving the shoulder dart legs closer together in order to open up the side dart legs. Isn't this cool how this happens? Math is fun. Depending upon your bust fullness, you may need to snip through the hinge at the armhole to prevent puckering. This will also cause a little bit of distortion in the shape of the armhole, but we'll fix that in the next step. When the openings for the shoulder and side darts are just about equal or where you want them to be, tape everything down. Now we need to do something that's called truing the pattern. And to true a pattern means to make sure it is accurate, correct, and complete, that you haven't forgotten anything. And most often it means making sure that the seams that are going to be sewn together match and that the corners are 90 degrees. And also that when you fold the darts, it creates the little mountain and curvy thing like it's supposed to. To true the pattern, extend the waistline toward the center front, extend the center front line to meet the waistline, and this is your new center front. Redraw the armhole if needed, and then draw your darts. And it's going to be almost exactly like I described before. Find your bust apex like you did when you're making the dart, and it shouldn't have moved, but I like to double check just in case it moved around just a little bit. Draw lines from the center of the darts to the shoulder and the side seam to the bust apex. Determine the distance from the dart point to the bust apex and make a mark for both the shoulder dart and the side dart. Draw the dart legs from the new dart point to the original dart leg positions along the shoulder line or side seam. For the side dart, make sure that's either even or angling up. And as you can see, your side dart legs will cross over the cut parts that you just made. And that's the way it's supposed to be. You're not going to be following those open spaces for your dart legs. Fold the dart legs just as if you were going to sew them shut. And either using a marking wheel or a push pin, make holes along the seam line to mark the shape of that edge. And you may need to kind of true the side seam or shoulder seam just a smidge. Open up the darts and draw, connect the dots to draw this seam line dart shape. Tape everything to the backing paper to hold the adjusted pattern in place. Now, I've given you a lot of information in this video. So I've created a sewing guide in PDF instant download format that has over 100 photos that walks you through step by step how to draft the foundation, making sure the darts are pointed in the right direction, and how to do a full bust adjustment. You can find the link to purchase it in the description box below. Now that I have my early 1940s foundation, I can use it to draft patterns from the Haslam 1940s fashion booklets, pattern booklets. I do hope you'll continue to join me on my adventure as I take my wardrobe from schlumpy, work from home, pandemic wardrobe and remake it into something elegant and timeless. I want an elegant and timeless wardrobe. And don't forget to check out my website, modernretrowoman.com, for other goodness. I've got recipes there. I've got wisdom from our mid-century mentors, all sorts of things. So until next time, have a fabulous Technicolor day.